مرحبا بكم أعزائي المستمعين في حلقة جديدة من بودكاست النادي مع ضيف مهم سوف نلتقي به مجددا في هذه الحلقة. I'm glad here, listeners, to have back our master, Rose Daly. Welcome back and thank you very much to join us again.
Thank you for inviting me again. It's my pleasure.
We really had a very great interview in the first episode where it was really impactful with wealth of wisdom, reflections, and expertise. A lot of people were very happy to listen to it and learn from it, really. I'm glad to have you back. And today we will have a master talk about a master.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be back. I'm glad that our previous session was helpful to people and useful for them.
So today we are going to talk about Habil Aliyev. And the first question.
Oh, wonderful.
Wonderful to have you talk about him, Master. So actually, who was Habil Aliyev?
Habil Aliyev was an extraordinary musician from Azerbaijan who played the kamanche, a four-string upright spike fiddle, which is very commonly found in many parts of Transcaucasia, Iran, Central Asia. It goes by different names. It's called either kamanche or pichak or different other names like that. And Habil Aliyev was the foremost exponent of that instrument from Azerbaijan. He is no longer alive, unfortunately. I don't have his exact dates of birth and death, but he died approximately 8 years ago or 9 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And he was perhaps the most influential Azeri musician of the 20th century. He had an extraordinary command of his instrument and was an amazing improviser and developed the technique of playing the Azeri kamanche to a very, very high degree, much higher than what he found when he was young. And of course, he was also a very great teacher. And there are today lots and lots of excellent kamanche players in and from Azerbaijan who are very clearly influenced by his style and are very clearly students coming from his school of playing. So he was obviously a very, very successful teacher as well.
So when was your first encounter with him and with the Azeri music?
With Azeri music, I had been familiar with it for many years. And many, many years ago, maybe 30, 35 years ago, somebody gave me a cassette with various different pieces of music from different areas of the world. And on that cassette was one little piece in the Mugam known as Bastanigar from Azerbaijan, played by a kamanche. And I heard this piece and I was really amazed by it. I didn't know who this player was, but it was obviously a really brilliant musician. And I started asking around, trying to figure out who was this person playing on that recording. And I discovered eventually that this was a recording of Habil Aliyev himself, who I had no idea who he was. And so I started looking for other recordings of his. The only recording released in the Western world of Habil Aliyev was by a French recording company called Ovidis, which I don't think exists any longer. And they had one recording of solo kamanche with a simple percussion accompaniment by Habil Aliyev himself. And so this recording was quite a major discovery for me because it had a lot of different pieces and I had a chance to hear a lot of his music. And I started looking then for other recordings. Of course, these are the days when the Soviet Union was still in existence. And Azerbaijan, as we all know, was a part of the Soviet Union. And so what I did find were recordings of Habil Aliyev from the old Soviet label Melodia. There were a couple of recordings of his, very old ones. and I got hold of them as well. Again, just copies on cassettes in those days.
Yes.
And I started developing my collection of Habil Aliyev recordings from whatever sources I could find.
Yes.
And I was invited several years ago, in the late 1990s, to go and do a workshop, a seminar, and a concert in Israel. And I went, and there was a professor of ethnomusicology there called Peretz Eliyahu, who was himself from Dagestan, which is very close to Azerbaijan in the Caucasia region. And he was a musician himself. He was a classically trained musician, but who was also very much interested in the local musical styles, especially of Azerbaijan. So he played tar also. And he had invited Habil Aliyev, together with Ramiz Guliev, who was a wonderful, who still is a wonderful tar player in Azerbaijan, perhaps their foremost tar player. And so I had a chance to meet both of them. And I had a chance to meet with Habil Aliyev and Ramiz Guliev, and we played some pieces together. And that was my first acquaintance with him.
Which year was that?
And, which was about a week at that time.
Ah.
I'm trying to remember exactly. I think it must be something around 96 or 97. I'm not quite sure which one exactly. It would be either 96 or 97. So
that was the first meeting.
that was the first meeting. Very important experience for me, because I had a chance to actually see and hear this music, which I loved so much, in a live context. Subsequently, Habil Aliyev was invited. It must be about 1998 or 99. It must be. He was invited to Athens, to the Athens Concert Hall for a concert, together with Firuz Aliyev, who was a wonderful tar player. And they came together and they played a concert. And we invited them to our house after the concert later that evening. They came and played for us, and we had a chance to reconnect, which was really wonderful for me. And then in 2004, Athens was afforded the role of being the city for the Olympic Games. But because Athens is a small city, and Greece is a smallish country, it did not make sense to put the entire infrastructure of an Olympic Games in such a small city, because it would be certain that it would not be used thereafter. It would just decay. So they decided to designate 4 other cities in Greece as Olympic cities as well, with the central one being Athens. And one of those cities was the city of Heraklion, which is the large city just next to where I live, here on Crete. So I was given the task of organizing a 3-day cultural event here in Heraklion, celebrating the beginning of the Olympic Games. And within that context, I'd made a proposition which included inviting a large number of musicians from all over the world to come and play. And amongst those musicians, I definitely included Habil Aliyev. And so I invited him here to Crete to come and do this concert within the context of the Olympic Games in 2004. But I also made a proposition to him to do a seminar here at our school, Labyrinth, and also to stay on for a couple of weeks so that we could take him to the studio and do recordings and filming to get as much of his repertoire as we could documented. And he did that, of course, and he stayed with us, and he was our guest for nearly a month at that time. And so I took him to the studio as often as possible, together with the Iranian percussionist who plays tombak, Pedram Khavarzamini. And I recorded him with Pedram together. And these recordings, we've managed to preserve these recordings. And I'm looking for a way actually to release them as a recording so that they're available to all people.
Interesting.
And on a couple of the recordings, I had the honor to actually play with him. And one of the pieces is actually a composition of my own, in which he plays an extended solo improvisation. So that's my acquaintance with Habil Aliyev,
Mm.
personal acquaintance, and I also participated in the seminar he did here and had a chance to see how he approaches teaching and his approach to music in general.
Yeah, I think we'll deep dive into this part and such experience, but
Okay?
I mean, we need some background about his beginnings, or maybe the way he perceives the music, the music in Azerbaijan back then, from what you have learned maybe from seeing him and meeting him.
Yes.
Mm.
Well, from what I understand of Azeri music, I'm not an expert on this subject, but I have a certain amount of experience in that field.
Hmm.
The music of Azerbaijan, uh, of course, the Azeri people, they speak a variant of the Turkish language,
Hmm.
uh, which it's not too far from what we Turkish in Turkey, but it is different,
Mm.
but it is understandable. Uh, and uh, they're so they're Turkish-speaking people. Um, of course, due to the Soviet years, their religion was suppressed,
Mm.
but they're basically Shiite Muslim. Their religion originally was Shia Islam,
Hmm.
so they're quite close to the Iranians in that respect.
Hmm.
And also, of course, a large part of Western Iran is actually populated by Azeri people, and there are more Azeri people in Iran than there are in Azerbaijan.
Mm.
Even though that may seem funny to us, because a very large portion of Western Iran is actually populated by Azeri people, particularly the major city of Tabriz.
Uh-huh.
So they're musically, I would say, much closer to Iranian music, although not identical.
Hmm.
But they're much closer to Iranian than they are to, should we say, contemporary Istanbuli Turkish music.
Mm.
So they use the term mugam to describe their, which of course is their own variant of the Arabic word makam. Um, they have a system of mugam which is very close to the system which you find in Iran. It's closer to that system than it is to the Turkish mugam.
Uh-huh.
Um, so they have mugam like Humayun or Bayati Shiraz or Duga, all these different
Mm.
mugams which are very similar to the Iranian versions.
Mm.
Their technique for playing the Comanche is extremely developed, um, developed to a very, very high degree, and with a very, very special style all of their own. It seems that musicians of Habil Aliyev's age, when they were much younger, were taught by the traditional method which we call meshk,
Hmm.
which is the student with the pupil playing phrases which get repeated, repeated, and repeated until they're digested. And
Hmm.
they would have to learn a very, very large repertoire of phrases
Mm.
in all of the different mugams. And this was a very long process which would last years, learning phrase by phrase in
Mm.
huge, massive compositions.
Hmm.
And so this is the way that they would learn in those days.
Hmm.
From what I've seen of contemporary Azeri musicians, even though they do have musical academies and they have, sort of quite an organized educational system,
Hmm.
the way of learning is still very much the same.
Mm.
The way you learn this music, really, you have to learn bit by bit these little phrases and learn these very long compositions.
Hmm.
I have friends who have been to Azerbaijan in recent years to study their music, and they've told me that that's the way we learn there. We learn in the same way.
Mm.
So I think that despite the fact that there is an organized system of education there, and they probably learn, reading and writing music and that sort of stuff,
Mm.
which is a useful tool. But I
Yeah.
think the way of learning their traditional repertoire has not changed all that much.
Hmm. Mm.
There is the other question, of course, in countries like Azerbaijan and all of the former Soviet republics, which is that their music and their tradition and their educational systems were very, very much influenced by and affected by their proximity and their subjugation, basically, to Russia.
Mm.
And this did not always have a beneficial effect. Quite often, these traditions were westernized, the scales were tempered, and elements of harmony were introduced, which were not always the best. And the music would quite often lose its original character and its original style and its beauty.
Yeah.
I think Azerbaijan was perhaps one of the slightly luckier examples that didn't fare so badly under the Soviet influence. And so, especially in the years since the demise of the Soviet Union, they seem to have been able to move back to the roots of their music and to the older, more traditional styles with comparative ease, perhaps compared to other countries which had a rather more difficult time. So, yes, I mean, the music of Azerbaijan today, I would say there is a lot of very, very good players, extraordinary players, who do play in the old, original, traditional style. And there is, of course, there is new composition as well.
Yeah. Interesting. So that's the way he was raised, we would say, in the same way that it continues today with the new generation.
It seems to be that way, yes.
Yeah.
It seems that way.
Yeah. And the community of musicians, we have seen a lot of videos and recordings, and maybe you have seen much closer insight of the Azeri communities, the way they play, the way they improvise, their gatherings, whether with food on the table, like endless evenings and improvisations and elevations, let's say.
Yes.
So that community is really impressive, the way we see
Yes,
it till today.
I think it's still very alive today. Of course, this music it has moved to the concert hall also. I mean, you do see very westernized concert hall presentations of this music. Yes, that's true. But from what I've understood from Azeri colleagues of mine who I've had a chance to speak with on this subject, it's still a music very much alive in the lives of the people who practice it. It's not just confined to the concert hall. It's music which is important at various social functions. The Mogam tradition is basically what we might call the urban tradition. There is also in Azerbaijan the Ashik tradition, which they use a type of saz, which is known as chogur or saz. And that's the tradition of the rural bards, known as Ashik. This is quite a different tradition. The Mogam tradition, which includes the Kamanche, the tar, these instruments, this is very much an urban tradition, which is very, very much found in the city of Baku, for example. But it's very much an important part of their lives. It's a very old tradition, and interestingly enough, there are people in Azerbaijan who are trying to recreate the old ensembles of Azeri music as they would have been 600, 700, 800 years ago, reintroducing instruments which have been lost since then. And they're using very much the same source material as is being used by both the Turks and the Iranians. For example, all three of these traditions go back to composers of the 14th century, such as Abdul Qadir Meragi, who was himself from what is today Azerbaijan. So there is a strong connection there, going back to these very old traditions. And there is a lot of emphasis on trying to keep all of this alive today.
Great. I think it's time to discuss or introduce the Azeri music, Master, in terms of concept and practice.
Yes, the Azeri urban tradition, the Mogam tradition, it has forms which are very similar to those which we find in the Iranian style, what we call the Peshrev or Bashrav in Arabic, is Pishtaramad for them, which is the same as the Iranian terminology. They have the Pishtaramad, they have the Reng, which is a sort of a lighter dance melody, or they have the Tasnif, which is another type of song. These are the forms which are very commonly used. And they're very similar, if not identical, to those used in Arabic music. they have a system of usul, which are the rhythmic patterns which are relevant to the different forms.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's the mugams themselves,
Yeah.
which are very similar to the Iranian dastgah and avaz,
Yes.
and quite different from the Turkish maqams.
Mm.
We do encounter maqams. There is a very famous maqam in Azerbaijani music called duga. There's also a very famous Turkish maqam known as duga, which is entirely different. They're totally different, those two.
Yeah.
And we quite often see this, the same name, but referring to a totally different musical entity. The improvisation in Azeri music is rather stricter than it would be in either the Arabic or in the Turkish tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, my phone's making a ping. Sorry about that. Slightly, the improvisation is stricter, and whereas there's a bit more freedom, I would say, in the improvisation of the Turkish and the Arabic maqam approach, where you have quite a lot of freedom to choose which is your next modulation and things like that. For the Azeri and Iranian music, it's rather, you have to follow rather specific patterns and rather specific routes and rather specific sequences of modulations, which are preordained. So in all respects, I would say that Azeri music is quite close to the Iranian classical tradition. Yes.
I mean, what are the differences between Persian and Azeri music? Because they see themselves extremely different.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, of course, if you listen to an Azeri Kamanche player and then listen to an Iranian Kamanche player, I think just about anybody could tell the difference.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing.
Right.
There's a lot in the structure of their music which is similar, but the idiomatic sound is totally different, of course. Also, the approach to the tar, which is a very important instrument in both Azeri and Iranian music. The instrument itself is actually quite different in structure, but the approach to playing it is radically different in Iran from what it is to Azerbaijan. Even though the whole concept of the music, the theory, so to speak, is actually quite similar, but there's the question of the playing style and the idiomatic nature of it, which renders it very, very different. And so anybody listening to it can see that, oh, these traditions are connected, yes, but there is a very, very distinct Azeri way of approaching it and a very distinct Iranian way of approaching it.
Yeah. Now I remember the great recording of the concert between Ustad Shajarian, who passed away.
Yes,
I mean,
unfortunately, yes,
fortunately,
yeah.
and Habil himself,
Yes.
which is interesting. Persian Azeri concert between.
Yes, if I'm not mistaken, they performed a very famous Iranian Sega Tasnif in Mugam Sega. Yes, their traditions are so close that they can actually play together. And, when I was in one of the concerts that Habil Aliyev played in Israel when I met him the first time, at the same time, there was a very famous Armenian duduk player as well. And they played together perfectly normally. I mean, there's a lot of common repertoire. It's very, very sad that those two peoples are not on the friendliest of terms at the present time because they have so much shared culture. But no, it was possible for the Azeri or the Armenian or the Iranian musician to play together. It was quite possible. There's a lot of shared material between those three peoples.
Yeah, and I see also when they discuss the theories that Al-Urmawi, for example, or Al-Maraghi is either taken by the Azeris or taken by the Persians or the Arab. These are all shared by, like, ownership is taken here or there.
This makes perfect sense, actually, because you see, in the time when somebody like Meragi lived, or prior to that was Safi al-Din Urmawi or Qutb al-Din Shirazi. Of course, the names denote that both of these people were from what is today Iran. But we didn't have the same distinction in those times. Who is Persian? Who is Arabic? Who is Turkish? It was not the same as the modern nation-state way of describing, this one's from Turkey, this one's from Azerbaijan, this one's from Iran. It wasn't the same in those days. That people had quite often a multicultural identity, or they would be from Urmawi is from what is today Iran. I don't know what language he spoke or what languages he spoke, but he wrote in Arabic. Although that was probably not his native language. Or what's his name? Al-Farabi he wrote in Arabic, but apparently he was Turkish from the 9th century. So these different people, they didn't have the same ethnic identity as people do today. It was much more complex and much more multicultural in those times.
And I see that this is a sign of unity, actually. Like
it is.
If these guys are all ours, owned by all these regions, then we are one piece.
This is something which, to me, is extremely important for Middle Eastern culture in general. In Europe, we have a thing which we refer to as classical music, which is a unifying force. So in the 1940s, everybody maybe hated Hitler, but nobody hated Beethoven. So it never became a German problem. It was rather specific. And I think the entire Middle East needs very, very much these overarching multicultural figures like Urmawi or like Al-Shirazi or Al-Farabi or Abdul Qadir Meragi. These people are very important because they bridge the cultures and they show us that we have a lot of shared material. We all belong to the same traditions, that we have our own individual styles and idioms and things, but we all belong to the same basic trunk of the same tree.
Interesting. Back to Habil,
yes.
Master. What trait is Habil as a master or as an artist?
Well, it seems that he was very, very innovative. And that's something which is very significant in any artist, because the Comanche was a totally different instrument before and after Habil, and during his lifetime as well. So he was a person who completely revolutionized this instrument and gave it totally new dimensions and new possibilities. And not only the Comanche, but the musical tradition itself. For example, especially his rendition of the Mugam Sega was considered to be so important and influential and distinct that there's a variety of the Mugam Sega in Azerbaijan today, which they refer to as Habil Sega.
Oh,
which is this is Habil's Sega. This is how he did it. And so that's it's a major influence that somebody should have. So it seems that he was a very innovative musician, very, very skilled, somebody who managed to develop the instrument further, give it new possibilities. And of course, he was also, seems that he was a very great educator as well, because, as I said previously, we have a huge number of students and Comanche players in Azerbaijan today who clearly reflect his influence and are obviously students of that particular school of playing.
Interesting. I think it's time to focus on your work with him, actually, and the experience in Labyrinth. Let's just have it in deep dive, Master.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I said, we invited Habil Aliyev to Labyrinth in 2004. for a quite extensive stay of almost 1 month, actually.
Mm.
And apart from the concert and which he had to do and things like that, we also had him here for a seminar. So he had various students with different bowed instruments. We didn't have many Comanche players, but we had violinists and lira players. So he was teaching aspects of the repertoire of Azeri music. He taught us some compositions. As I said, I took him to the recording studio very frequently, together with Pedram Khawarizmini, and they recorded a large number of pieces of his versions of these various different mogams. I also had the opportunity to play a few pieces with him in the studio. We performed together one particular piece, which is a very famous Azeri melody called Ay Giz. And this is actually a contemporary composition by a fairly contemporary composer called Jihangirov. And we played it together. He played the Comanche and I played it on a large instrument, which is a distant relation of the Comanche, a contemporary instrument called tarhu, which played an octave lower than what he was playing. I had a lower register. So we played this melody together. tasnif form,
Mhm.
especially for him.
Ah.
And so I made a recording of this piece. But what this piece actually is, it's just something to set him up for a long, extended improvisation stage. I didn't really like to sort of put him to the task of having to learn a whole bunch of new melodies. So I played all of the phrase material for him, together with Pedram Kavarzemini. And then we gave him a large section in the middle to do an extended improvisation, which is what he did, of course, and very, very beautifully as well. So that was I was able to sort of collaborate with him on those two pieces in the recording context. also, as I said earlier, when I met up with them the first time in Israel, we performed a few pieces together in a small concert, a few Azeri pieces which they gave me the scores and I played together with them. That was I was very lucky to have that experience to be able to actually play with him. And of course, during my association there, I managed to learn a number of the Azeri pieces, which are some of my very favorite compositions, actually. I'd often play them.
Master, I mean, can you describe the experience of playing with him? I'm sure there's a different cultural aspect to it.
You know, one interesting thing is that I've noticed this with other musicians as well. It is surprisingly easy to play with very great masters. They make it easy for you. And I've seen this with other musicians as well. You know, you always imagine, oh, it's going to be difficult to play with this guy. He's so good. The opposite is true. That they go out of their way to make things easy for you. And you know, this is one thing. This is actually one of the characteristics that I've noticed of great master musicians is that they can do that. They can make it very easy for the people playing with them. Everything's so clear and so precise that it's very easy to find your place in there. So that for me, you know, was a wonderful experience to be able to play with somebody who I admired so much and whose music I loved so much for so many years. That was an amazing experience.
And how would you learn a piece with him? Would he do the mishq style with you guys?
The meshq style, yes. He would play the melody a few times. You know, what I would do actually was, because I didn't want to tire him with lots of repetition, I would record it once, go away and work on it on my own, and then come back to him for meshq style, so that we didn't have to do too many repetitions. I already knew enough, but it was just basically a question of correcting what I'd learned. So that because, you know, I didn't want to put him to too much trouble, because he was already quite an elderly man. But the meshq style, that's the way that he would work. That was.
And how would the day look like with Habil?
It was interesting because it was during the time of the Olympic Games here in Greece. We actually set up a television satellite disc in the village of Kutetsi so he could watch the Olympic Games on television, which he very much enjoyed. So, you know, we would then have meals together and play a bit in the afternoons and things like that. He came with his wife also. She was with him also. So she was sort of looking after him and cooking for him and cooking for us also. So it was a very relaxed 1 month, you know, every day playing a bit, every day, you know, almost every day, not every day, almost every day going to the studio for an hour or two, not too much. So I didn't want to pressure him, you know, and push him at all. Just a bit, you know, get a bit done every day, and it gradually built up over the days. So I have a lot of video recording from those studios, the studio as well, which I'll certainly send to you. And it was a fairly relaxed time. It was sort of end of summer, really, here. And so we sort of gave them, you know, quite a lot of time and space to relax and enjoy their stay here. We took them around some of the antiquities here of Crete. And every day a bit of playing, sort of nice, peaceful, relaxed time.
Yeah, and how was he doing in the studio? I mean, does he have any special preferences or approaches in the studio, or he will just go like improvise?
Very, very easy in the studio. We just sort of get him started, and he just wouldn't stop. He'd just keep playing and keep playing. And you know, some musicians, they can be difficult in the studio, and they get, you know, they're insecure. They want to do it again and again and again. Habil, no, he just played everything once, and that was it. And it came out perfect, great. And so very, very easy in the studio, very easy to work with. And I was surprised because, you know, quite often the older musicians, are not so experienced in using some of the more modern recording techniques like playback and things like that. On the one composition which I did for him, it was necessary that I play all the parts and then give him the recording, and he would wear the headphones and play along with it. And I was a little bit concerned maybe he's not so used to that. No, he was completely used to it. It was fine. He did that perfectly well. Yeah. So he was a very easy person to work with in the studio, and he was, as a person, he was an absolute gentleman. Also, he was, he didn't say very much because we didn't have a common language. His Azeri Turkish and my rather bad Istanbuli Turkish didn't allow us all that much room to communicate verbally. But no, he was an absolute gentleman, very, very, very easygoing and very, very positive, very easy man to work with, very, very easy man.
How about some observations about his practice? Did you observe him practicing or preparing for something?
He didn't actually. No, he'd just go into the studio and start playing. That's it. Which he didn't seem to need any warm-up time or anything of that nature. Which that is also fairly typical of musicians of that older generation, especially when they reach an advanced age. They don't seem to practice very much anymore in the same way that we practice when we're younger. They just seem to have it, and so when they sit down to play, they just start, and it starts. They go into that performance zone very quickly, and without any difficulty. It's just like eating or breathing for them.
Yes.
Doing that. Yeah. So he didn't seem to have a practice routine at all. Actually, during his stay here, I don't know what he would have done when he was at home in Azerbaijan, but here, no, he'd just pick up the instrument, start playing. That's it.
Maybe it became a second nature. That's it.
I think that's what happens. That at a certain age and after so many years and so much experience, and so much obvious, very hard work in his youth, it just seems that it became second nature. Exactly.
How about his exposure to the other instruments? I'm sure you have shown him your instruments.
Yes. Well, Habil had actually done a fair amount of traveling. He had played concerts in various different parts of the world. He was designated one of the Soviet Union's foremost folk artists. And I think he was sent on various cultural missions to various parts of the world. He'd even played, from what I'd read in his biography, he'd even played concerts in Afghanistan and places like that. And so he was quite widely traveled. And so he'd obviously seen a lot of instruments, and he'd obviously seen a lot of different things. He didn't express any great surprise at seeing new and strange instruments. He didn't know the lira, which we have here on Crete. He was not aware of that instrument, but he did like it. He liked it very much, and he enjoyed it. But I think he was quite experienced at seeing different musical instruments in different parts of the world.
And I think that would apply to the music he has maybe experienced. And I don't think he plays or memorizes any other music other than the Azeri ones, right? Or maybe his own style.
As far as I know, his only musical practice was within the confines of Azeri music, yes.
Yeah, because maybe some of them believe that playing other musics might touch into their taste, or maybe their own, or maybe there is no reason to do that, actually.
I think that is probably the better explanation, actually, that they just didn't feel a need to do that. For a musician like himself, I would imagine for the majority of his life, he would have had very limited access to recordings of anything but Azeri music, or perhaps Russian. So I don't think that he came into extended contact with other musical styles. Musicians in the Western world, ever since the late 1960s, have easy access to recordings of music from all over the world.
mm,
Whereas he was, of course, in the Soviet Union, which up until the late 1980s uh, did not have all that much access to other traditions of that nature. And I think that it was not something which was particularly stressed for musicians like himself. He was considered to be an artist of the Azeri Azerbaijan folk style of playing. They referred to it as folk style, even though it was actually what we refer to as a classical style. But I think that what was expected of him was to be a representative of the music of Azerbaijan, and that's, I think, what he did. Very, very well, of course.
and therefore no need to be, influenced by the idea of harmony or orchestra or these things.
I never heard that in his own playing, no, even though I've heard many other Azeri musicians who include elements of harmony in their playing, some of them quite extensively, actually. But in Habil's playing, I didn't notice any influence of that nature at all, no. He seemed to be very much connected to the older style of Azeri music.
Master, what about the observation, your own observations in the seminar, and his teachings, whatever he has, done in those days in Labyrinth?
Yes.
Anything to mention in here that worth discussion?
Well, I think all I can really say there is what we said previously is that he used very much the traditional Meshk style of teaching,
Yeah.
and that he had great patience, of course, as well, because some of our students were not so adept at absorbing these melodies which were not familiar to them. And he'd be very patient and repeat it over and over again so the student would learn it correctly, and then go on to the next bit, and we'd eventually complete a composition. The lesson was 90% playing and maybe 10% talking, maybe 10%. It was very much a matter of playing and repetition, that perhaps was due to the language barrier. I don't know if that would be identical, but in Azerbaijan itself. But I did get that impression that this is very much sort of a hands-on tradition where you have to repeat and absorb the phrase material as exactly as possible.
Yeah, and I'm sure that was a very unique experience in Labyrinth at the time.
Oh yes, yes. Yeah. Although we do have other teachers who teach in that style, in the older times, that was the style of teaching in Turkey, but the contemporary Turkish musicians tend to rely much more heavily on written scores and things like that. Whereas, for example, musicians from Afghanistan are still using the old Meshk style. They refer to it as talim. And the same thing is true of Indian musicians as well. They use the same method, talim, which is this sort of imparting bit by bit this massive phrase repertoire to the student.
Yeah.
And it's really the only way to go about it for some of these traditions.
Rose, I would like you to comment on the underestimation of artists and masters like Habil being labeled of not having an academic training.
Well, yes, I've seen this. It's very interesting that many of these traditions, they've actually resisted being theoreticized for over 1,000 years. And they remain deeply idiomatic traditions. I know here on Crete, many people were quite critical of my own teacher, the late Kostas Mundakis, who was by far, he and another one, Thanasis Kodaros, were the two foremost lira players of the 20th century.
Yeah.
But Kostas Mundakis taught, but he did not know how to use staff notation or things like that. And many people have been critical that, well, how can you teach when you don't know how to read and write music and things like that?
Yeah.
But he used very much a Meshk system, actually. It's very similar. He had a rudimentary way of writing using letters, which was just helpful for a student to remember something.
Yeah.
But if I look back, in the second half of the 20th century, he was the most successful teacher of traditional music in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And the proof of that is the fact that there are so many students around today who were students of his with that method of teaching, who are today really brilliant players. So that's the proof of it, is the result. And I think the same is true for many musicians who come from indigenous traditions, where they don't use the Western system of education and the conservatoire approach. I had this discussion recently with a good friend of mine, a teacher of classical singing in Turkey, the Turkish classical singing style, a lady who was one of our teachers at Labyrinth. And, she recently had the experience of trying to teach opera singers how to sing in her style. And she was describing to me the complete difference in approach and the rather extreme difficulty, actually, in getting these people who come from a totally different educational style to see things in a totally different way, because otherwise they would not be able to do it.
Yeah.
So I think it is important that we recognize that in every culture, the traditional manner in which they teach, which has developed over centuries, is to be taken seriously, because it's probably the best method of teaching. That doesn't mean that it's not open to improvements, yes, but improvements must be made on something which has already been through a long, long developmental process, and which is actually very effective. And I've seen that with, as I said, Afghani musicians who teach with the old meshq method without using written notation very much. That, okay, you can write these melodies down, you can do this, you can do all sorts of things, but really the best way to learn that music is with that old method. Because it really stays with you, it really embeds itself deeply within you through that method. So I think it's very, very important that we take extremely seriously all of these traditional methods of teaching which have been developed over centuries in each of the different regional traditions.
Yeah. Now, would we see, for example, Habil lacking some skills, like a technical skill or an expressive skill, because he came
No,
from this kind of
absolutely not.
yeah.
No. I think he was far in advance of all the other Comanche players of his time.
Yes,
Uh,
yes,
uh,
yeah. And let's talk about the legacy of Habil
uh-huh.
and what we have today and the impact and
Well, we have today a very large number of really extraordinary Comanche players from Azerbaijan. Uh, and they all quite clearly bear the stamp of Habil's influence. You can see that very plainly in the way they play. So obviously he's left a huge legacy exactly there in the fact that he has following him a large number of young players, extremely competent, extremely well educated, who are absolutely brilliant players, and that's the best testament that any teacher can have.
Interesting. Master, I think let's have some time here with our listeners
Okay.
to appreciate some Habil music and courtesy of your recordings. Thanks to
Oh,
you, actually.
uh-huh.
So I leave the floor to you to take us into a tour with Habil and the Azari music.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, okay. Well, perhaps the most famous pieces of Habil's repertoire, uh, his rendition of the Mugam Bayati Shiraz is particularly famous. There are many versions of it being played by him himself, actually, on YouTube. Or his rendition of Duga also is wonderful, absolutely extraordinary. As is also, those are two classical mugams in the whole sort of exposition, the classical exposition of them. But he also did beautiful renditions of some of the older folk tunes.
mm,
Um, so perhaps one of the most famous melodies, which is claimed by both Armenia and Azerbaijan, called Sare Gerin. It's a very, very famous melody.
mhm,
And there's a very old recording of Habil playing that from the old Melodia recording.
mm,
Or also, there's an old filmed version of it, which one can see on YouTube.
mm,
Right? These are some of his real sort of hallmark pieces,
mm,
as also is, but his most famous rendition, of course, is the Magam Sega,
mm,
which is considered to be sort of perhaps the finest rendition of Magam Sega in the Azeri repertoire. Also, the Mugam Charga, which is a very important Mugam for Azeri music,
mm,
his version of that is absolutely wonderful. Every Mugam which he played, he gave a very special character to him. Mugam Shur, of course, which is a very, very important Mugam with a huge repertoire. Every rendition of his was something quite unique and something which has remained as a sort of a hallmark piece, really, within that particular Mugam.
yeah. What we should look into when we listen to his recordings? I mean, can you shed some
Uh,
light on some of these
yes.
beautiful things
Well,
there?
uh, his actually extraordinary ornamentation of the melodies,
Mm,
very, very rich ornamentation. Uh, and of course, in his improvised sections, very, very innovative, a lot of very creative imagination at work, and uh, the expressivity of the pieces and his style of playing. His style is
mm,
very, very evocative, very expressive, and very passionate.
mhm,
Um, and these are the basic characteristics, I would say, the things which really make his playing stand out and make it quite exceptional.
mhm. Interesting. I remember I heard something very strange for him. A very expressive piece for a chicken, and yeah,
This
have
is
you?
this is interesting. Yes,
Yes,
there is one piece where he makes the sounds in the of course the piece he makes the sound of animals
yes,
in especially the chicken.
yeah,
In I think it's sort of a comic piece in a way.
yeah,
This is actually this is interesting.
mm,
Musicians, especially bowed instrumentalists,
mm,
seem to have a tradition of doing this, of imitating animal sounds.
yes,
Even the very great and illustrious Turkish composer of the beginning of the 20th century
mm.
has one recording of him doing an imitation of various different animals,
Who?
including Tamburi Jamil Bey.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah,
Mm.
including wolves and dogs
Yeah,
and all sorts of different animals.
yes,
It seems that musicians do that. I mean, musicians themselves are famous for having a good sense of humor.
yes,
Uh, it's very rare that I've met a musician who doesn't have a sense of humor, and I think it's an important part of being a musician
mm,
is having a sense of humor.
mm,
And so we see that reflected in some of these recordings by these really great masters, very serious people. But here they
mm.
are doing this funny recording with a chicken or a wolf or a dog or something like that, or a
Yeah.
donkey. Yeah,
And Habil, I
and
think, did the whole story. You can understand
yes,
the whole story listening to his piece.
it's a story. Yes,
Yeah.
that's what it is. Yeah,
Mm,
and Jamil Bey did the same thing of a story. He also did another one of a mother putting a baby to sleep and the baby waking up,
mm.
uh, done all with a Comanche. Yeah,
No, I didn't listen
uh,
to that actually.
yeah. It's called what's it called? Yanik Nini, I think it's called that one.
Mm,
I think that's the title in Turkish.
mm,
Um, but yeah, no, these are things commonly done by musicians,
mm,
imitations of sounds of everyday life and things like that.
mhm. Great. I think we will listen to these examples you have highlighted. I'll put some of these
Okay.
pieces to our listeners.
Okay.
And we have already listened to two pieces, the duet and
Okay.
the one with the improvisation, your composition. I think we had really a great time with you, Master, again,
I enjoyed it very much.
discussing Habil and his art and your experience with him. And
Yes.
I think we will meet again soon for the
Oh,
other
fine.
other
Fine. Yes.
interviews we have discussed previously about your instruments invented and your thought about the advancement of instruments of the modern music and the modern music concepts.
Fine. Great.
Yeah, thank you very
One
much.
last,
Mm,
one last thing which I could sort of say
mm,
for Habil Aliyev was that he was quite definitely my very favorite instrumentalist of all
mhm,
time.
mhm. And why is that?
I just love that sound. I think that was just amazing. His whole approach to music, his sound, everything about him was
Mhm.
just my absolute favorite.
Yes, he's a great master, and I
Yeah.
really thank you again for your time. And
Thank you very much. Thank
yeah,
you.
we'll see you again soon.
کوچه رندان به سلامت بگذر زاهد از کوچه رندان به سلامت بگذر تا خرابت نکند صحبت بدنامی چند گفتی هنرش نیز بگو نفی حکمت مکن نفی حکمت مکن از بهر دل آمکن نفی حکمت مکن از بهر دل آمیچن